preacher know he knows better. Thank you, Brother Ricardo, for that gracious introduction. Pastor Price, thank you for your leadership and all that you do. Dr. Hamilton, thank you for your graciousness, your wisdom, and your leadership. To the board of the Ballard House, to all the leaders and politicians, to the folk who are keeping the lights on, to the folk who are going to clean up the church after we leave. I want to say thank you. This is my first time ever stepping inside this church. And I'm a bit overwhelmed. The importance of this city for a young country boy from Moss Point, Mississippi, cannot be overstated. This place means something to me. Maybe it's the images, the sounds, the example of heroism, the beauty and brilliance of this place that's the source of my love. So I'm so honored to be here. Now I'm going to get in a little trouble. So I'm honored to join you on this solemn occasion where we remember the senseless murder of 4 little girls and 2 young boys. But commemorations can be a tricky thing. We can easily slip into a kind of remembrance that keeps the jagged edges of the past at arm's length. We can recall the details in such a way to blind us to the depths of the evil. Politicians and leaders perform their professional piety, their requisite piety. We acknowledge what was done and yet still reconcile themselves to the evils of our own days, as if nothing has been learned or carried forward. We perform the ritual act every year, but emptied of significant meaning for our times. Commemorations can be a tricky life. But we have to admit, I feel like I'm going to preach. Especially after that choir, yes? And did you hear Donnie? My Lord. But we have to admit, it would be dishonest not to, that it isn't easy to commemorate horror. It isn't easy to remember terror and loss. Babies blown away. Innocence snuffed out because of unbridled hatred. It is easier to forget, to find comfort in the illusion of progress. To find comfort in the illusion of progress, to do what the late Toni Morrison calls disremember. To disremember the details of history's trauma, to narrate them in such a way that they don't arrest our feet or grab hold of our thoughts. Some things are best left alone. Because if we linger there for too long, we may not be able to get up. And in this world where white folk can turn rabbit on a dime, we got to get up. on the coast of Mississippi. I don't sound like this on Morning Joe, though. Sometimes I want to. As a child growing up on the coast of Mississippi, I remember seeing the distant stare of my grandma, trying to follow our eyes to that far-off horizon where she had buried memories, or noticing a slight shift in her head, a turn in the mouth that let me know that we had come to the edge of something that had to be left over there. It reminds me of what W. Ralph Eubanks wrote about Mississippi, and I suspect it is no less true for Alabama, that to find a good story, one had to, quote, explore the silences, for it is within the parts of our history we have chosen to shroud in silence in which our stories best reside. Blocked grief. Blocked grief. Pain and loss shrouded in silence, vulnerability and madness shrouded in silence. Our history deeply entangled with trauma like coiled snakes in a maiden hole. It is easier to forget. But we must remember as best we can, not for the sake of politics, not for the sake of politics. These sorts of days are all too often conscripted into an unseemly ritual to affirm how far America has come, to assert, despite the evidence, that we are still on the road to a more perfect union. Not for the sake of politics, no, but we must remember in order to attend to the meanings of the loss, to know what the grief might say to us today. In this sense, this commemoration, unlike the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, is about our dead. Just seeing the family. It's not about a march, it's not about a triumphant story of the civil rights movement, it's about our dead. It's about our responsibility to them, our obligation to carry them forward as part of our story. And that requires, I believe, speaking the silences and tending to the grief. Tending to the grief. If politics must intrude, if it must intrude, and it will, let it be the politics of tending. Let it be a politics of tending. Tending gathers politics around rooted, knotted practices. It gathers politics around the doings and sufferings that evidence habits and ways of living forged over a life lived. To be open to such experiences, to tend to roughly hewn hands that pick cotton. Mark a life of toil. It means to attend to the bloodshot eyes that signal too much drink. To the raucous laughter that offer a glimpse of the depths of joy, and to tend to that blank stare that reveals either defeat or possibility. Tending can be expressed in what Miss Ella Baker said. The question she asked, even when she was losing her memories, and whenever she met someone, she would say, "Who your people?" Y'all understand that question? And to answer that question is laden with meaning. To tend to our grief and loss, to tell our stories which are full of joy and triumph, tragedy and loss, isn't easy, especially in a society that clamors for absolution and forgiveness. Our wounds and memories threaten to rend the soul, right? Because telling the story of trauma often fragments how we remember. I'm speaking here from a place of personal wound. A grandmother who lost so many babies to suicide. Racial violence that defines so many of our lives. How many of you know somebody who's buried the loved ones at the hands of police? reach back in our history and folk just won't tell the stories of what they experienced, shrouded in silence. Trauma fragments how we remember. Wounds and memories threaten to render the soul, and if that happens, nothing else matters. We're lost. Telling the story of trauma in fits and starts isn't history itself in any formal sense. It is the way traumatic memory works. Recollections caught up in the pitched battle between remembering and forgetting. Facts bungled on behalf of much-needed truths. We try to keep our heads above water and tell ourselves a story that keeps our legs and arms moving below. Right? To keep the terror from overwhelming everything. Philosopher John Dewey was asked about black folk in Harlem, and he said, at least that's what they said, he said, I don't know how these folk get up in the morning. Sometimes I don't know either. Baldwin wrote in his last book, The Evidence of Things Not Seen, he said, quote, terror cannot be remembered. One blots it out. End quote. I'm lecturing right now. Y'all all right? Yeah. This is the way I do it in class, and this is the way I do it in the pulpit. They blend together. Terror cannot be remembered. One blots it out. But the cruel irony, of course, is that the terrors end up moving us about anyway. My daddy told me that he grew up not ever being hugged by his mama. And I can tell the story why. Old Hick, her daddy, did something to her that impacted her ability to touch in a loving way.
It's all right.
The cruel irony is that the terrors move us about anyway. We dig trenches to redirect the memories, to get them to flow away from us. But the memories always return, flooding everything, no matter how high we build the stakes. 60 years ago, they killed babies. 60 years ago, they killed babies here. That fact doesn't easily fit into a triumphalist narrative of the Civil Rights Movement. Of course, you can move quickly to the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but the barbarity of the act remains. They killed babies. Our babies. And it was the culmination of an all-out assault on us. From fire hoses and dogs in Kelly Ingram Park, to the white student protest, to the desegregation order, to the vitriol dripping from the mouths of politicians like George Wallace, we tell the story of the Civil Rights Movement, and rightly so, as this heroic tale of progress that these ordinary people fortified by their faith, dared to challenge a nation to live up to the true meaning of its creed. And here, in a steel town like Birmingham, America's Johannesburg, these ordinary folk exhibited the courage to confront evil, and in doing so, helped birth a new America. But that story all too often runs past the cruelty. That story all too often runs past the cruelty to find comfort in redemption. Like those Christians on running towards Easter Sunday. Just run past Sabbath. Sunday Christians, as if they were sitting with those two women in front of the rock. Those Easter Sunday Christians, they guaranteed salvation. Where were they on Sabbath? No, God is dead on Sabbath. At least we don't know when he's going to rise, right? So we find comfort in the triumphalist narrative.
Yeah.
We run past I did it. We run past I did it. All the bodies of known and unknown people who made this moment possible. But commemorations like this one, y'all all right?
Yeah.
Commemorations like this one force the nation to confront the ugliness of who we are and of what we've done, without the comforting illusion of the triumphalist story. Not to suggest that this ugliness is who Americans will forever be, but to remind the nation of what it is capable of. And my God, we need reminded today. The bombing of this special church complicates the standard narrative, because at its heart is the theft of innocence and the consequent rage that threatens to overrun everything. It's an all too human story. I'm thinking about the grandfather of Denise McDonnell, Deacon F.L. Pippin, who recognized his grandbaby's patent leather shoe. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? It reminds me of that moment in Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, when Stan Page, that's a wonderful name, Stan Page pulled out of a river a red ribbon attached to the scalp of a baby. And he said, "What are these people? Tell me, Jesus, what are they?" That ribbon, that shoe, Deacon Pippin would express his rage as he watched his baby girl, his daughter, grapple with the significance of that shoe. And what did he say? "I'd like to blow up the whole town." A human response. That isn't your neat account of black folk as long-suffering. That isn't your neat account of a theological claim about redemptive suffering. Even with the power of our faith in hand, we had to deal with the reality of that shoe. With what happened to Carol Robinson, with what happened to Addie Mae Collins, with what happened to Cynthia Wesley, with what happened to Virgil Ware, with what happened to John. We had to deal with the loss of our babies. Yeah. And if you read the UPI story about the bombing the next day, or the stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times on September 16th, 1963, they lead with the murder of the 4 little girls and the 2 boys, but immediately turn to the quote-unquote hysterical crowds that threatened the city of Birmingham. The Post reported that Dr. King wired President Kennedy and informed him that he was going to Birmingham, quote, to plead with Negroes to remain nonviolent. But he said, unless, quote, listen to this now, this is Dr. King, unless immediate federal steps are taken, there will be in Birmingham and Alabama the worst racial Holocaust this nation has ever seen. This wasn't Harlem in 1964. This wasn't Watts in 1965. This wasn't Detroit. This wasn't Stokely Carmichael talking about black power. This wasn't the North on fire. This was Birmingham, Alabama. On this day of commemoration, if we are to tend to our grief, we mustn't lose sight of the humanity of those who had to endure the evil of those days.
That's right.
We become these superordinate moral creatures capable of forgiving everybody. We can just suffer the abuse and keep moving and keep loving and calling on our Lord and standing in our faith. What does it mean to deal with our wounded humanity? Come on. I'm trying to open something up, Judge. On this day, we mustn't lose sight of the humanity. These children weren't simply symbolic abstractions. They belonged to somebody. They belonged to somebody who loved them unconditionally. Ain't nothing worse than a parent having to bury a child. That's not what you're supposed to do. They belonged to somebody who loved them unconditionally, who gave them the resources to imagine themselves in the fullest of terms. Just imagine the innocence of their laughter in the basement. The primping in the mirror that we read about. The pride in their gait. The joy of life. Imagine it all. And these wild beasts, as Frederick Douglass called them. These wild beasts took them away, and our grief boiled over. Now that grief had to be joined with purpose. As Dr. King said in his eulogy, quote, "They are the martyred heroines of a holy crusade for freedom and human dignity." So they've said something to us in their death. They have something to say to every minister of the gospel who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. They have something to say to every politician who's fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. They have something to say to a federal government that is compromised with the undemocratic practices of Southern Dixiecrats and the blatant hypocrisy of right-wing Northern Republicans. They have something to say to every Negro who passively accepts the evil system of segregation and stands on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice. Their death, King says to us that we must work passionately and unrelentingly to make the American dream a reality, end quote. These were powerful words. But sometimes the joining of grief to the purpose leaves the grief unattended. Dr. King spent more time in that 7-minute eulogy here than talking to the families who had to bury their babies. The families in Black America had to mourn and make sense of unimaginable loss with little time to grieve. Because the nastiness of the world kept coming. And with little time to mourn, we had to carry our dead forward in our silent resentments. Trauma. Wound. So on this day, we have to linger on the humanity lost, to insist on the deep human connection that made their lives possible, even as we fight for a better nation. Now, am I going on too long? No. That's a preacherly tactic, but I'm asking an honest I know how much okay. Now, one cannot help but note the irony here. We commemorate the 60th anniversary of the bombing against the backdrop of a country that seems to have lost its damn mind. I just felt my mama slap me in the back of the head. For many, the rancor and the vitriol of our current days sound all too familiar. An echo of a past that never was past. Some want to blame it all on Donald Trump. But we know better. We've had to deal with these folk for generations. And there are those who still believe, as their forefathers and mothers believed, that ours must remain a white nation. And what is clear today, at least it is clear to me, is that the ghost of this country haunt. Yes. Americans are divided, and those divisions go well beyond ideological differences. They cut to the marrow of the bone. And too often we see each other as enemies. Disagreement is saturated with contempt. Mutuality drowns in the bitterness of our public discourses. The sense of common purpose and public good has been thrown into the trash bin as we huddle in our silos. And race and racism shadows it all. The great replacement theory. Can you imagine? Panic and terror around demographic shifts, assaults on voting rights. You know this in Alabama. Bitter debates about American history. We find ourselves living among men and women mad with the fever of a distorted view of liberty, willing to throw away this entire experiment in democracy as they cling to their fantasies. James Baldwin had it right. James Baldwin had it right. He said, quote, "The horror is that America changes all the time without ever changing at all." Now, to be sure, there are a set of principles that define this republic. Principles articulated at the moment of creation. Quote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are what? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." But those ideas have been fought over, contested, blood spilt in the name of them, right? There has been and remains something lurking in the shadows, something not so easily captured by phrases like our better angels or progress towards a more perfect union or faith in the founding principles. A closer look exposes the gap at the moment of creation between the stated ideals, the lived experiences that unravel them, and the lies we tell ourselves about it all, that split an emerging national consciousness in two. In other words, I just said in a very fancy way that the country is schizophrenic. It's mad. At that moment, somebody said that John Adams said to King George, at the moment in which he was giving voice to a conception of freedom, what did he say? He said, "We will not be your Negroes." At the very moment in which John Adams was giving voice to a notion of freedom, it was predicated upon an intimate understanding of unfreedom. We will not be your Negroes. That consciousness, that split in national consciousness, Americans are not who they say they are. Y'all thought I was going to come in here and give you that little traditional speech. No. What do we make of the fact that we have been lying to ourselves as a nation since the beginning about who we are and what we have done? A lie repeatedly told around race matters becomes a uniquely American form of madness. It seems to me, if we are sincere, and the question of sincerity is always a vexing issue in this country, we have to face the insidious workings of this lie, this particular version of the American story that touts our national virtue, if we are to imagine America anew. The time has come for us to examine ourselves for who we really are and in the full light of what we've done. And we must do so without the crutch of our myths about American exceptionalism. We must do so without the legends that protect our innocence. And that examination must involve an attempt to find out what is really happening here. Yes. And remembering the bombing of this church helps us do just that. The historical refusal to confront what is really happening in this country has again resulted in Americans not knowing who we really are. Trump is just a symptom of the rot. You know, so many folk thought if we just see the back of his head, we would be all right. We knew. The novelist Ralph Ellison, upon receiving the National Book Award in 1953, said that, quote, "The way home we seek is the condition of our being at home in the world, which is called love, and which we term democracy." Then he said, "Our task is always to challenge the apparent forms of reality, that is, the fixed manners and values of the few, and to struggle with it until it reveals its mad, very implicated chaos, its false faces, and on until it surrenders its insight and its truth. For Ellison and me, America has yet to discover itself. Amen. We are not at home in the world, and it has made something quite loveless about this country. Mean-spirited we are, greedy we are, selfish we are, and lonely we are. Baldwin hit it on the head in 1960 with a speech in Kalamazoo College. He said, if we're going to get at the heart of the malaise, he said, quote, I want to suggest most seriously that before we can do very much in the way of clear thinking or clear doing as it relates to the minorities in this country, quote, we must first crack the American image and find out and deal with what it hides. I'm coming to, I don't have much patience left. I'm taxing your patience, but I have to say this. It's damn near impossible to get to the heart of the matter in the country because madness congests the heart of this place. People are comfortable in their silos, comfortable trafficking in stereotypes, comfortable with grievance and hatred, comfortable with lies. To quote my man Jimmy again, he said, they don't really know what it is they're afraid of. But they know they're afraid of something. And they're so frightened, Jimmy said, that they're nearly out of their minds. Right. With this commemoration, not only are we to tend to our grief, but we must also confront that fear and madness. You know, I found Toni Morrison's novel, Beloved, illustrative of so much of what I'm trying to convey here. Set in Cincinnati during Reconstruction, we're confronted with characters like Setha and Baby Suggs and Paul D, who are shaped by the horrors of slavery and desperate to hold back memories of experiences of Sweet Home Plantation. Grief soaks their lives. But in a moment of dizzying doubt and clarity, the character Stampede, who works on the Underground Railroad and who helps Setha to freedom, he says this: white people, quote, believed that whatever the manners under every dark skin was a jungle. Yes. Swift, unnavigable waters, swinging, screaming baboons, sleeping snakes, red gums ready for their sweet white blood, end quote. And those stereotypes stood in for the actual human beings. They helped to dehumanize us and to justify the cruelty. But then Stampede goes on to say, quote, the more colored people spent their strength trying to convince them how gentle they were, how clever and loving, how human we are. The more they use themselves up to persuade whites of something Negroes believed could not be questioned. And the deeper and more tangled the jungle grew inside. Y'all following me? Yes. But then, if you haven't read the novel, you gotta read it. Stampede turns the tables, and his insight sets the stage for a revolutionary possibility. What he says here opens up space for a different kind of possibility, right? A different way of acting in the world, a different kind of imagining, a different way of understanding the meaning of this commemoration. Listen at his words. But it wasn't the jungle blacks brought within them to this place from another livable place. It was the jungle white folks planted in them. And it grew. Right, he's not done yet. And it grew. It spread. In, through, and after life, it spread until it invaded the whites who had made it. touched them, every one. Altered them. Changed and wanted to be so scared. They were mad. Hold on. Let me get it right now. It spread until it invaded the whites who made them, touched them, every one, changed and altered them, made them bloody, silly, worse than even they wanted to be. So scared were they of the jungle they had made. The screaming baboon lived under their own white skin. The red gums were their own. Dehumanizing people, that's fiction, y'all. It is the jungle of their making that entangles us all. But Stampede says here, though, the problem, y'all listen, the problem is not us. Even if it is in us. The problem is them. And that is revelation. Jimmy put it this way. I'm not the N-word. I've never thought of myself as the N-word. The question is why you need the N-word in the first place. So I'm going to give you the question, who is really the N-word? The day after the bombing, and I'm coming to a close for real, Eugene Patterson, the executive editor, white executive editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, penned a column entitled "The Flower for the Graves." This white Southern brother wrote about a mourning mother who holds a small patent leather shoe that belonged to her daughter. Quote, "We hold that shoe with her," he said. Remember, executive editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, September 16th, 1963. Quote, "Every one of us in the white South holds that small shoe in his hand. It is too late to blame the sick criminals who handled the dynamite. Only we can trace the truth, Southern. You and I, we broke those children's bodies. We watched the stage set without stain. We who go on electing politicians who heat the kettles of hate. We, the heirs of a proud South who protest its worth and demand its recognition, we are the ones who have ducked the difficult, skirted the uncomfortable, cabaled at the challenge, resented the necessary, rationalized the unacceptable, and created the day, surely, when these children would die. We hold the shoe in our hands, Southern." This white executive editor of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution goes on to say, "Let us see it straight and look at the blood on it. Let us compare it with the unworthy speeches of Southern public men who have traduced the Negro, match it with the spectacle of shrilling children whose parents and teachers turned them free to spit epithets at small huddles of Negro school children for a week before this Sunday in Birmingham. Hold up the shoe and look beyond it to the State House of Montgomery, where the official attitudes of Alabama have been spoken in heat and anger." Then he says, "We know better. We created the day, and we bear the judgment." End quote. Those words could be spoken today. As politicians stoke grievance and hatred, as those quiet and disinterested folk stand by complicit with the forces that threaten our democracy. Dr. King wired George Wallace and said, "The blood of those poor little children is on your hands, your irresponsible and misguided actions have created in Birmingham and Alabama the atmosphere that has induced continued violence and now murder, end quote. Commemorating what happened 60 years ago forces a confrontation with what is happening right now in the full light of history. And this day commemorates an evil that we had to bear, but the nation must own. You know better. You always have known better. You must be better. We will tend to our grief and we will tend to our dead. We will remember our dead, not as symbols, but as babies who were loved deeply. Yes. We will remember the sorrow on this day, the sadness on this day, and the rage caused by your words and your neglect. But let me tell you today that you must remember you created it. Yes. And you bear the judgment. And maybe, if this isn't tinkling brass and cymbals, maybe, if we commemorate it right, tend to our dead and tend to our grief and bear the judgment together, maybe we can find the courage to fight for an America together.